The night was colder than usual, the kind of chill that crept through Garen's modest cabin no matter how fiercely the fire roared in the hearth. The ex-knight leaned back in his worn chair, sipping the last of his bitter ale as the wind howled outside. It was a familiar sound, one he'd grown to find comfort in over the years of self-imposed exile. Here, deep in the heart of the woods, there were no battles, no orders, and no expectations. Just silence, solitude, and the ghosts of his past. A loud thud against the door shattered that silence. Garen froze, every muscle tensing as his hand instinctively moved to the hilt of the sword resting by his side. He hadn't drawn the weapon in years, but the reflex remained, sharpened by too many fights and too much loss. Another sound followed, softer this time, like something sliding down the door. A groan, low and pained, reached his ears. Garen rose to his feet, his movements deliberate, as he crossed the room and unlatched the heavy wooden door. What he saw on the other side was no predator, no bandit, and certainly not anything he expected. A figure slumped against the frame, shivering and barely conscious. She was cloaked, but even in the dim firelight spilling from inside, Garen could see the furred ears poking through her hood, the sheen of claws peeking from beneath trembling fingers, and the unmistakable shape of a tail dragging along the ground. Her golden eyes flickered open briefly, locking onto his with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw and barely audible. "Don't let them find me." Before Garen could respond, she collapsed forward into his arms. The girl was heavier than she looked, but Garen managed to drag her inside and lay her on the worn cot in the corner of the room. His gaze swept over her as he adjusted the blankets, trying to make sense of the situation. She was unlike anyone or anything he'd seen before. Her cloak had slipped open, revealing a lithe body clad in tattered leather armor. Beneath it, patches of fur covered her arms and legs, blending seamlessly into smooth skin. She looked humanoid, but not entirely human. Demihuman, Garen thought grimly, though he'd only heard of such creatures in passing. The firelight highlighted the dried blood on her side, staining the torn fabric of her tunic. She'd been injured, likely in a fight. Whoever or whatever had done this was likely still nearby. He shook his head and grabbed a damp cloth, pressing it gently against the wound. The girl stirred, a soft sound of pain escaping her lips as her eyes fluttered open again. "Stay still," Garen said gruffly, his voice rough from disuse. Her gaze darted around the room, then back to him. For a moment, she looked ready to bolt, but the pain in her side kept her rooted. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice trembling. "Doesn't matter," he replied, focusing on cleaning the wound. "What matters is who you are, and why you're bleeding all over my floor." She winced as he pressed harder on the gash. I was running. They're after me. They?" Her silence was answer enough. Garen sighed, setting the cloth aside and reaching for the herbs he kept in a small wooden box. "You're not giving me much to work with here, girl. Who's after you? Bandits? Soldiers?" When she didn't respond, he glanced up and caught the guarded look in her eyes. There was something wild about her, something that spoke of a life lived on the edge. She was afraid, but not just of him. "Rest," he said finally, his tone softening despite himself. "You're safe here, for now." She stared at him for a long moment before exhaustion overtook her, and she sank back into the cot. Her breathing evened out, though it remained shallow, and Garen watched her for a moment longer before turning back to the door. He bolted the cabin shut and stepped outside, the cold biting against his skin. The ground around his home was undisturbed save for the girl's faint tracks. If she was being pursued, her hunters hadn't made it this far. Yet, Garen's grip tightened on his sword as he scanned the tree line. The wind carried no sound of approaching danger, but he knew better than to let his guard down. Years of isolation hadn't dulled his instincts, and something about the situation set his nerves on edge. As he re-entered the cabin, the girl stirred. Her ears twitched, and her eyes opened just enough to track his movements. "You shouldn't have let me in," she murmured weakly. "Didn't have much of a choice," Garen replied. What's your name? Rishka, she said after a pause. Rishka, he repeated, the name unfamiliar on his tongue. You've got trouble following you, don't you? Her silence was confirmation enough. You need rest, he said, though his tone carried a weight that suggested he expected answers soon. We'll talk in the morning. Rishka's eyes fluttered shut again, but her breathing remained uneven. Garen returned to his chair by the fire, his sword resting across his lap. He didn't plan to sleep that night. The girl's arrival had shattered the fragile peace he'd carved out for himself, and he had a sinking feeling that whatever trouble she'd brought with her was only the beginning. Dawn broke over the treetops, golden light seeping into the cabin through cracks in the wood. Garen sat by the fire, his sword still resting across his lap. He'd spent the night keeping watch, his ears tuned to every creak and groan of the forest. The girl, Rishka, she'd called herself, remained on the cot, her breathing shallow but steady. When she stirred, her ears twitching slightly, Garen rose from his chair. He approached cautiously, his heavy boots scraping against the worn wooden floor. Her golden eyes flickered open, focusing on him with guarded wariness. You made it through the night, he said gruffly. That's something. Rishka struggled to sit up, wincing as her injured side protested. The blanket fell away, revealing the full extent of her disheveled state. Torn armor, dried blood, and a weariness that seemed to weigh her entire frame down. I didn't ask for your help, she muttered, though there was no heat in her voice. Didn't need to, Garen replied, setting a bowl of water and a cloth on the table beside her. You looked half dead when I found you. Figured you weren't in a position to argue. She reached for the cloth, her movements slow and deliberate, but her hand faltered. Garen sighed and picked it up himself, dampening it in the water before kneeling beside her. Hold still. Rishka tensed but didn't resist as he cleaned the dried blood from her side. His touch was firm but not rough, his calloused hands steady as he worked. The proximity was unfamiliar, intimate, even, and Rishka's sharp eyes studied him with an intensity that made him acutely aware of the space between them. Why are you out here? She asked suddenly, her voice quieter now. Could ask you the same thing, Garen countered without looking up. I'm being hunted, she said, her tone matter of fact. I thought that was obvious. And I'm supposed to believe you stumbled onto my doorstep by chance? He paused, meeting her gaze. What aren't you telling me? Rishka hesitated, her golden eyes flickering with something unreadable. If I tell you, you'll wish you hadn't helped me, she said finally. Try me. She took a deep breath, her ears flattening slightly. There's a human, noble, powerful, cruel. He's been hunting my kind, capturing us, draining us of our magic. My people call it lifeblood. To him, it's a resource, a way to make himself stronger. Garen's expression darkened, but he didn't interrupt. I escaped, Rishka continued. Barely. They'll come after me, and anyone who helps me will be a target. Her gaze sharpened. That includes you. Garen leaned back on his heels, processing her words. He'd heard whispers of such things in his past life, stories of humans exploiting demihumans for their own gain. He'd dismissed them as rumors, but now, you should have kept running, he said finally, standing. I'm not the kind of man you want on your side. I didn't have a choice, Rishka snapped, her voice rising. I was dying. I needed help. You think I wanted to involve you? Her words stung more than Garen expected, though he masked it with a scowl. Fine, but if they're coming, we need to move. Staying here is a death sentence for both of us. Rishka looked away, her ears drooping slightly. I just need to reach my people. If I can make it back, they'll protect me. Protect us. Us. Garen raised an eyebrow. Don't lump me into this. You're involved now, she said simply, meeting his gaze, whether you like it or not. By midday, Garen had packed what little he needed, a weathered pack filled with dried food, water skins, and the few weapons he still had worth carrying. Rishka moved gingerly, her injuries slowing her down, but her determination was evident. The forest seemed quieter than usual as they set out, the air thick with tension. Garen led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the trees for signs of pursuit. Rishka followed close behind, her steps careful but deliberate. "You're not much of a talker, are you?" she said after a while, breaking the silence. "Don't see the point," Garen replied without looking back. Rishka huffed, her tail swishing behind her. "You're not exactly inspiring confidence." "I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to keep you alive." She didn't respond, but Garen could feel her eyes on him, studying him in the same way she had back at the cabin. As the day wore on, their progress slowed. Rishka's injuries made it difficult for her to keep up, and Garen eventually called for a break near a small stream. He watched as she knelt by the water, her reflection rippling in the current. "You're not used to traveling with others, are you?" she asked, her tone softer now. "No," he admitted, "and I don't plan on making a habit of it." Rishka smirked faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You're a real charmer. You know that?" Garen shook his head, leaning against a tree as he kept an eye on their surroundings. Despite her sharp tongue, he found himself drawn to her resilience. There was a strength in her, even in her battered state, that reminded him of the man he used to be. "Why did you stop?" she asked suddenly, her gaze fixed on him. "Stop what?" "Whatever it was you did before you ended up out here. You weren't always this grumpy hermit, were you?" Garen's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He didn't owe her his past, and dredging it up wouldn't do either of them any good. Rishka seemed to sense his reluctance and didn't press further. Instead, she rose to her feet, wincing as she adjusted her cloak. "We should keep moving." Garen nodded, pushing himself away from the tree. As they resumed their journey, a flicker of unease settled in his gut. Rishka's words from earlier echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever trouble she'd brought with her was far from over. The forest stretched endlessly before them, the trees growing denser with each passing mile. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Rishka moved with more confidence now, though her steps were still cautious, and her breathing betrayed the lingering pain of her injuries. Garen kept a few paces ahead, his sword drawn and ready, his eyes scanning the path for signs of pursuit. It wasn't long before the uneasy quiet of the forest was broken by the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. Garen froze, raising a hand to signal Rishka to stop. She obeyed, her ears twitching as she listened intently. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't just one pair of footsteps, there were several. Garen turned to Rishka, his voice low and urgent. "Hide." Rishka hesitated, her eyes darting to him. "What about you?" "I'll deal with it," he said firmly, gesturing toward the underbrush. For a moment, it seemed like she would argue, but she relented, slipping into the shadows of the trees with surprising ease. Garen positioned himself in the middle of the path, his grip on his sword tightening as the footsteps grew louder. 3 figures emerged from the trees, mercenaries, judging by their mismatched armor and the weapons they carried. The one in the lead, a tall man with a cruel grin, spotted Garen immediately and slowed his pace. "Out for a stroll, old man?" the leader sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of a dagger at his side. Garen didn't respond, his gaze steady as he sized them up. They were well armed but sloppy, their movements betraying overconfidence. "We're looking for someone," the leader continued, taking a step closer. "A girl. Might have passed through here recently. Furry ears, tail. You'd remember if you saw her." "Can't say I have," Garen replied evenly. The leader's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. "See, I don't believe you. A man living out here all alone? You must have seen something." One of the other mercenaries shifted uneasily. "Maybe he's telling the truth, Bran." Bran shot the man a glare before returning his attention to Garen. "I think you know something, old man, and I think you're gonna tell us." The tension was palpable, the air thick with the promise of violence. Garen didn't wait for them to make the first move. With a practiced fluidity that belied his years of isolation, he surged forward, his sword slicing through the air. The mercenaries were caught off guard by the suddenness of the attack. Garen's blade bit into Bran's side before the man could react, sending him sprawling to the ground. The others drew their weapons, but their disorganized swings were no match for Garen's precision. Within moments, it was over. Two of the mercenaries lay motionless, and Bran, clutching his side, dragged himself backward along the ground. His eyes were wide with fear as Garen loomed over him. "Who sent you?" Garen demanded, his voice cold and unyielding. Bran coughed, blood staining his lips. "You don't know what you're getting into," he rasped. "The noble, he'll come for you too. You're already dead." Garen didn't flinch, his sword hovering inches from Bran's throat. "Who sent you?" Bran's grin returned, weaker this time but no less defiant. "You'll find out soon enough." Before Garen could press further, Bran slumped to the ground, his body going limp. Garen exhaled sharply, lowering his sword. The forest fell silent once more, save for the distant rustle of leaves. Rishka emerged from her hiding spot, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "You didn't have to kill them," she said quietly. "They wouldn't have let us go," Garen replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He cleaned his blade on one of the mercenaries' cloaks before sheathing it. Rishka approached cautiously, her gaze lingering on the bodies. "They were sent by him," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "Then we need to keep moving," Garen said. He turned to her, his expression hard. "If more are coming, we can't afford to waste time." She nodded, though her steps were slower as they resumed their journey. The encounter had shaken her, and Garen noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her cloak. "You've seen death before," he said after a while, his voice softer now. Rishka glanced at him, her golden eyes filled with something unreadable. "Not like this," she admitted. "Not for me." Garen didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. He'd seen more than his share of death, enough to numb him to the sight of it. But Rishka's reaction reminded him of a time when it hadn't been so easy to take a life, when every battle left its mark on him. They continued in silence, the forest growing darker as the sun dipped below the horizon. When they finally stopped for the night, Garen set about building a small fire while Rishka settled against a tree. "You could have walked away," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "What?" "Back there," she clarified. "You didn't have to fight them. You could have told them I wasn't here and let them pass." Garen looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't walk away," he said simply. Rishka studied him for a long moment, her ears twitching slightly. "Why?" Garen didn't answer right away, his attention focused on the fire. "Let's just say I've made my share of mistakes," he said finally. "Leaving you to die wasn't going to be one of them." For the first time since they'd met, Rishka's guarded expression softened. She didn't thank him, but the look in her eyes said enough. As the fire crackled between them, the tension that had hung over them all day seemed to ease, if only slightly. Garen leaned back against a log, his sword within arm's reach, while Rishka curled up near the fire, her tail wrapping around her legs for warmth. They were far from safe, but for the moment they had each other. The following morning, a low mist clung to the forest floor, muffling their movements as Garen and Rishka resumed their trek. Despite the uneasy quiet, both of them felt the weight of urgency pressing down like an unseen hand. Garen's pace was steady, purposeful, but Rishka's steps dragged slightly, her wounds and exhaustion catching up to her. "You're slowing down," Garen said without turning. "I'm fine," Rishka replied, though her voice lacked conviction. He stopped, turning to face her. Her tail drooped, and there was a pallor to her features he hadn't noticed before. Without a word, he stepped closer and crouched, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You're not fine," he said. "Sit." Rishka's ears flattened in annoyance, but she relented, sinking onto a mossy patch of ground. "I told you, I just need to keep moving," she muttered. "And I told you I'm not dragging a corpse through this forest." Garen shot back, kneeling beside her. He pulled a small leather pouch from his pack and began rummaging through it. Rishka watched him, her tail twitching slightly as he produced a salve and some bandages. You're surprisingly well prepared for a hermit, she said. I wasn't always a hermit, he replied curtly, dipping 2 fingers into the salve and motioning for her to lift her tunic. She hesitated, her golden eyes flickering with discomfort, but finally complied. The fabric rose, revealing the wound on her side, a deep gash that had only partially scabbed over. Garen's brow furrowed as he inspected it. This should have been stitched, he muttered, applying the salve with a careful hand. Rishka hissed through her teeth at the cold sting of the ointment, her claws lightly digging into the earth beneath her. You're not exactly gentle. Not here to coddle you, Garen said, though his touch softened slightly. The closeness between them felt oddly charged, and Rishka's eyes flicked to his face as he worked. His rugged features were set in concentration, his calloused hands steady despite the tension in his jaw. You're different than I expected, she said after a moment. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. What's that supposed to mean? Rishka shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at her lips despite her discomfort. You're not like the humans I've dealt with before. Most of them wouldn't have given me a second thought, let alone risk their lives. Garen didn't respond immediately, his focus returning to the bandage he was securing around her waist. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Not all humans are the same, just like your kind, I'd imagine. Her smirk faded, and for a moment, there was a vulnerability in her gaze that Garen hadn't seen before. You'd be surprised how few of us believe that. He straightened, brushing his hands off as he met her eyes. Then maybe they're not looking hard enough. Rishka's ears flicked, and she looked away, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. By mid-afternoon, they reached the base of a rocky incline. The forest thinned here, giving way to jagged cliffs and patches of exposed stone. Rishka paused, tilting her head as her ears twitched toward an unseen sound. What is it? Garen asked, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. She frowned, her tail swishing nervously. Something's following us. Garen's grip tightened, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. How far? Close, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Too close. The words had barely left her mouth when the first arrow whistled through the air. Garen reacted instinctively, grabbing Rishka and pulling her behind a large rock. The arrow struck the ground where she'd been standing moments before, the tip quivering in the dirt. Stay low, he ordered, drawing his sword. Rishka nodded, crouching behind the rock as Garen stepped out to face their attackers. 3 figures emerged from the trees, different from the mercenaries they'd faced before. These men moved with purpose, their weapons gleaming in the fading sunlight. Hand over the girl, one of them called, his voice cold and commanding. We'll make it quick for you. Garen didn't answer, his stance shifting as he prepared for the inevitable fight. The men spread out, trying to flank him, but Garen's eyes followed their movements with a predator's precision. When the first man lunged, Garen was ready. He sidestepped the attack, his sword slashing through the air in a clean arc. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching his side as blood seeped through his tunic. The second and third attackers hesitated, their confidence faltering in the face of Garen's skill. Rishka watched from her hiding spot, her claws digging into the stone as tension coiled in her chest. The second man made his move, charging at Garen with a dagger. Garen parried the blow with ease, his movements fluid and calculated. With a swift strike, he disarmed the man, sending him sprawling. The third attacker, however, was more cautious. He circled Garen, his eyes flickering to Rishka's hiding spot. The moment he lunged toward her, Garen was there, intercepting the attack with a powerful swing that sent the man's weapon clattering to the ground. Rishka flinched as the man fell, his body landing mere feet from her. She looked up at Garen, her golden eyes wide with something between awe and fear. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. She shook her head, her ears twitching as she glanced at the fallen attackers. You didn't have to save me, she said quietly. Garen frowned, sheathing his sword. What kind of man would I be if I didn't? Her gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. Maybe you're not the kind of man I thought you were. He didn't respond, turning his attention back to the path ahead. We need to keep moving. There'll be more of them. Rishka hesitated, her tail swishing nervously, before falling into step behind him. For the first time since they'd met, she felt a flicker of hope, an unfamiliar, fragile thing that she wasn't sure she could trust. As they climbed the rocky incline, the forest fading into the distance behind them, Garen couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was only going to get harder. The weight of Rishka's trust, and the danger that came with it, settled heavily on his shoulders. But for now they had survived, and that was enough. The sky had turned a deep indigo by the time they reached the narrow cave at the base of the cliffs. Garen led the way inside, his sword still drawn as he checked the dark recesses for any sign of danger. The space was small but dry, shielded from the cold night wind that whistled outside. Rishka lingered near the entrance, her golden eyes reflecting the faint light of the stars. Her tail flicked nervously as she watched Garen inspect their temporary refuge. "It's not much, but it'll do," he said, sheathing his sword and dropping his pack onto the stone floor. Rishka nodded, stepping inside and settling onto a flat rock near the back of the cave. Her movements were slow, her exhaustion evident. Garen crouched near his pack, pulling out a small bundle of firewood and a flint. "We'll stay here for the night. Get some rest." "What about you?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. "I'll keep watch," he replied without looking up. The fire sparked to life after a few strikes of the flint, its flickering glow casting long shadows on the cave walls. Rishka leaned toward the warmth, her ears twitching as she pulled her cloak tighter around herself. "You can't stay awake forever," she said after a moment. "I've done it before," Garen said simply, sitting with his back against the cave wall, his sword resting across his lap. Rishka studied him for a long moment, her eyes tracing the lines of his face. There was a weariness there, etched deep into his features, but also a quiet strength that seemed unshakable. "You don't trust me," she said suddenly. Garen's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. "I trust you enough," he said after a pause. "That's not the same thing," Rishka said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. He didn't respond, his focus returning to the fire. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the distant howl of the wind. After some time, Rishka shifted, her tail curling around her legs. "You never told me why you're out here," she said, her tone casual but probing. "I don't see how that's important," Garen replied, though his grip on the hilt of his sword tightened slightly. "It is to me," she said, her ears tilting forward. "You saved my life, risked your own more than once. I'd like to know why." Garen sighed, leaning his head back against the wall. "Let's just say I've had my fill of people. This place is quiet. Simple." Rishka's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not the whole story." "No," he admitted, his voice low. "It's not." She waited, her gaze steady. But when he didn't continue, she let out a soft sigh and leaned back against the wall. "You're a hard man to understand, Garen," she said quietly. "I could say the same about you," he replied, his tone lightening slightly. Rishka smiled faintly, her ears flicking at the subtle warmth in his voice. "Fair enough." As the night wore on, Rishka's exhaustion finally got the better of her. She curled up near the fire, her breathing slowing as sleep claimed her. Garen watched her for a moment, his expression softening despite himself. She looked younger in sleep, the tension that so often marred her features smoothed away. Her tail twitched slightly, curling over her legs as if seeking comfort. Garen shook his head, forcing his gaze away. There was no room for sentimentality, not with the danger that still loomed over them. The hours dragged on, the fire burning low as the weight of the day settled heavily on Garen's shoulders. He couldn't shake the memory of the mercenary's words, the warning that had echoed in his mind ever since. "You're already dead." It was nearly dawn when Rishka stirred, her ears perking up as she sat up groggily. Garen was still at his post, though his posture had slumped slightly, his chin resting on his chest. You didn't sleep, she said, her voice thick with sleep. Garen blinked, rubbing a hand over his face. Didn't need to. Rishka frowned, her tail flicking in mild annoyance. You're going to burn yourself out. I've made it this far, he said with a faint smirk. She sighed, shaking her head. Stubborn. Survivor, he corrected, pushing himself to his feet. Rishka stood as well, stretching slightly before pulling her cloak around her shoulders. We should get moving. Garen nodded, gathering their belongings and extinguishing the remnants of the fire. As they stepped out of the cave, the morning sun cast a golden light over the rocky terrain. The forest stretched out below them, a sea of green that seemed endless. Rishka hesitated, her gaze sweeping over the landscape. There's a place not far from here, she said, her voice quiet. A village, or what's left of it. What do you mean? Garen asked, his tone sharp. It's where my people were attacked, she said, her ears drooping slightly. I don't know if anyone survived, but I have to see. Garen studied her for a moment, noting the tension in her posture and the flicker of pain in her eyes. If it's important to you, we'll go. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said, starting down the path. Rishka followed, her tail swishing nervously as they descended into the forest once more. The air was heavy with anticipation, the promise of answers and danger, waiting just beyond the horizon. The path to the remnants of Rishka's village was overgrown and difficult to navigate. Fallen trees and patches of brambles created obstacles at every turn, but Rishka pressed on with a determination that was almost palpable. Garen followed closely, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. The forest grew darker as they descended, the canopy thick with vines and ancient branches that blocked out the sunlight. The air felt heavy, tinged with the faint scent of decay. Rishka slowed as they neared a clearing, her ears tilting forward as she strained to listen. It's just ahead, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Garen nodded, gripping the hilt of his sword as they stepped into the open. The clearing was eerily silent, the usual hum of forest life absent. The remnants of the village lay before them, little more than a scattering of crumbled huts and charred wooden beams. Ash coated the ground, and the air carried the faint, acrid tang of old smoke. Rishka's steps faltered as she took it all in, her tail drooping. This was my home, she said, her voice hollow. Garen stayed close but didn't speak, sensing that words would only cheapen the moment. Rishka moved through the ruins, her fingers brushing against the blackened remains of a doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but her ears drooped low, and her tail hung limp. I thought I was ready for this, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Garen stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. You're still standing. That counts for something. She glanced at him, her golden eyes glimmering with a mix of pain and gratitude. Does it? It does, he said simply. As they searched the village, Rishka stopped abruptly near a large, overgrown pile of rubble. Her ears twitched, and her tail swished with sudden urgency. Wait, she said, crouching down to sift through the debris. What is it? Garen asked, stepping closer. There's something here, she said, her voice tight with emotion. She worked quickly, her claws scraping against the ash and dirt. Finally, she unearthed a small, intricately carved pendant, its surface marred but recognizable. Her fingers trembled as she held it up to the light. This belonged to my mother, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Garen watched her silently, the weight of her grief settling heavily in the air. She gave it to me before. Rishka trailed off, her eyes closing as she clutched the pendant to her chest. Garen placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. You're not alone in this. Rishka's eyes opened, and for a moment, she looked at him as if seeing him in a new light. She nodded, swallowing hard as she slipped the pendant into the folds of her cloak. We should keep moving, she said, her voice steadier now. As they moved deeper into the village, Garen's unease grew. The silence felt oppressive, unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He noticed faint markings on the trees and stones, symbols etched into the wood and rock that he didn't recognize. "Do you see these?" he asked, gesturing to one of the symbols. Rishka frowned, her ears tilting toward the markings. "They weren't here before. They're recent." "What do they mean?" Rishka shook her head. "I don't know, but they're not from my people." Garen's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "Then we're not alone." The faint sound of rustling reached their ears, and both of them froze. Garen's eyes scanned the shadows, his muscles coiled like a spring. Rishka crouched low, her claws flexing as her ears swiveled toward the sound. A figure emerged from the treeline. A tall, hooded man with a staff in one hand and a cruel smile on his face. Behind him, more figures stepped into view, their weapons glinting in the dim light. "Well, well," the hooded man said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I didn't expect to find such interesting company here." Rishka's growl was low and menacing, her claws digging into the dirt. "Who are you?" "Just a traveler," the man said, though his tone made it clear he was anything but. His eyes flicked to Rishka, then to Garen. "And you must be the human causing all this trouble." Garen stepped in front of Rishka, his sword drawn and ready. "If you're looking for a fight, you've found one." The man chuckled, his grin widening. "Oh, I don't think so. You're outnumbered. And your little companion looks like she's barely standing." Garen didn't flinch, his grip steady. "Eva faced vers odds." The man's grin faltered, and he gestured to his followers. "Take them." The clearing erupted into chaos as the attackers surged forward. Garen moved like a force of nature, his sword cutting through the air with precision and strength. Rishka fought beside him, her claws flashing as she tore into the enemies that came too close. The hooded man hung back, watching the fight with a calculated expression. As Garen and Rishka began to gain the upper hand, his smile returned. He raised his staff, murmuring words in a language neither of them understood. A surge of dark energy rippled through the clearing, and Garen staggered, the force of it slamming into him like a physical blow. Rishka cried out as the energy knocked her to the ground, her body convulsing with pain. The attackers regrouped, their movements emboldened by the hooded man's power. Garen struggled to his feet, his vision swimming as he raised his sword. "You're strong, human," the man said, his voice carrying over the din of the fight. "But strength won't save you here." Garen gritted his teeth, his eyes blazing with defiance. "We'll see about that." The fight raged on, the odds growing increasingly dire. Despite their exhaustion, Garen and Rishka fought with everything they had, their movements driven by sheer will. As the hooded man prepared another spell, Rishka locked eyes with Garen, a silent understanding passing between them. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice strained. Garen nodded, his gaze fixed on their enemy. Together, they charged, their combined strength a force that even the hooded man couldn't ignore. The battle reached its boiling point, the outcome teetering on a knife's edge as Garen and Rishka made their desperate move. The air was thick with tension as Garen and Rishka charged toward the hooded man. His eyes narrowed beneath the shadow of his hood, and a cruel grin curled across his lips. With a wave of his staff, another ripple of dark energy surged through the clearing, aiming to halt their advance. Garen braced himself, his boots digging into the ash-covered ground as he pushed through the force. The pressure was suffocating, but his resolve burned brighter. Rishka moved with agility and determination, her claws digging into the dirt as she darted to the side, flanking the enemy. "You can't win," the hooded man sneered, his voice laced with disdain. "This power is beyond your comprehension." Garen didn't reply. Words wouldn't break this man, only action would. He tightened his grip on his sword, charging forward with renewed vigor. Rishka used his momentum as a distraction, slipping through the chaos like a shadow. As Garen closed the distance, the hooded man thrust his staff into the ground, and jagged tendrils of energy erupted outward. Garen dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack, but the force knocked him off balance. He rolled to his feet, his sword gleaming as he deflected a follow-up strike from one of the attackers who had regrouped behind him. Meanwhile, Rishka leaped into action. With a feral growl, she pounced toward the hooded man, her claws outstretched. He turned just in time, his staff deflecting her initial strike, but her agility caught him off guard. She landed behind him, her tail whipping as she pivoted for another attack. The hooded man snarled, slamming his staff against the ground again. A shockwave erupted, throwing Rishka backward. She tumbled into the dirt, coughing as she tried to catch her breath. Garen used the opening, surging forward with a mighty swing of his blade. The man parried with his staff, but the force of the blow drove him back several steps. "You're persistent," the man growled, his composure slipping. "And you talk too much," Garen retorted, driving forward again. The skirmish around them continued, though the other attackers began to falter. Without their leader's full focus, their resolve wavered. Rishka regained her footing, her golden eyes blazing with determination. She exchanged a glance with Garen, their unspoken bond stronger than ever. "We take him down together," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Garen nodded, adjusting his grip on his sword. Together. Rishka darted forward again, her movements swift and calculated. She feinted to the left, drawing the man's attention, while Garen circled to the right. The hooded man spun, trying to keep both in his sights, but their coordination proved too much for him. Rishka lunged low, slashing at his legs, forcing him to jump back. The moment he did, Garen closed the gap, his sword arcing downward. The man barely blocked in time, but the impact sent a visible tremor through his frame. "Enough!" the hooded man bellowed, slamming his staff into the ground once more. This time, the energy burst outward in a blinding flash, throwing both Garen and Rishka backward. The force sent Garen crashing into a charred beam, while Rishka hit the ground hard, her claws scraping against the dirt as she struggled to rise. The hooded man loomed over them, his staff glowing with a dark, malevolent light. "You should have stayed in the shadows where you belonged," he hissed, raising his weapon for a final strike. A sudden roar echoed through the clearing, stopping him in his tracks. From the edge of the tree line, a massive figure emerged. An enormous beast, its fur bristling and its eyes glowing with fury. Rishka's breath hitched as recognition dawned on her. "Archon," she whispered. The beast was one of her kind, though far larger and more imposing. It barreled into the clearing, its claws raking through the enemy forces with ease. The remaining attackers scattered, their courage evaporating in the face of the beast's raw power. The hooded man turned his attention to the new threat, his grip on his staff tightening. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Archon growled, his gaze locking onto Rishka for a brief moment before focusing on the hooded man. Without hesitation, he lunged, his massive form colliding with the dark sorcerer. The ground shook beneath the impact, and the staff flew from the man's grasp. Seizing the opportunity, Garen pushed himself to his feet, adrenaline surging through him. He grabbed his sword and sprinted toward the fallen staff, determined to remove it from the fight. Rishka joined him, her movements still shaky but driven by resolve. The hooded man struggled beneath Archon's weight, his once confident demeanor unraveling. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice filled with desperation. Rishka reached the staff first, her claws wrapping around the dark artifact. The moment she touched it, a surge of energy coursed through her, but she gritted her teeth and held firm. Garen joined her, his hands steadying hers as they worked together to snap the staff in two. A deafening crack echoed through the clearing as the staff shattered, its dark energy dissipating into the air. The hooded man let out a howl of rage, his form flickering like a dying flame. Archon roared again, his claws pinning the man to the ground until the last vestiges of his power faded. The clearing fell silent, save for the labored breaths of the survivors. Archon stepped back, his massive form heaving as he turned to face Rishka. She approached him cautiously, her ears low and her eyes glistening with emotion. "Archon, I thought you were—" she began, her voice trembling. He rumbled softly, lowering his head to nuzzle her shoulder. Rishka closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she rested her hand against his fur. Garen watched from a distance, his sword still in hand. He didn't intrude, understanding that this moment wasn't his to share. Instead, he scanned the clearing, ensuring there were no lingering threats. When Rishka finally turned to him, her expression was a mixture of relief and determination. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "For everything." Garen nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "We're not done yet," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Rishka glanced at the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were breaking through the darkness. "No," she agreed, her golden eyes burning with resolve. "We're not." The ruins of the village were still, save for the quiet rustling of the wind and the distant sound of the forest reclaiming its land. Garen, Rishka, and Archon stood together, their faces etched with the exhaustion of the battle they had just won. The hooded man, once a formidable presence, was now nothing more than a shadow, his power obliterated with the destruction of his staff. The danger had passed, for now, but the tension still hung thick in the air. Rishka stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze drifting over the broken landscape. It was hard to tell whether the tears in her eyes were from the pain of the past or the relief of the present. She had fought to protect her people, and in doing so, she had come face to face with the very forces that had torn her world apart. Archon, sensing her sorrow, gently nudged her with his large, furry head. She stroked his fur, a soft smile tugging at her lips, though it was laced with sadness. The bond between them was undeniable, a deep connection forged through shared history and the weight of survival. Garen watched them from a distance, his thoughts a quiet storm. He had seen the woman in Rishka, the warrior, the protector, the fierce force. But now, as she stood with the beast that had once been her guardian, he saw a different side of her. A woman who had lost so much, yet continued to fight. A woman who carried her grief like a weight, yet had the strength to bear it. His gaze softened, his thoughts drifting to the impossible connection that had formed between them. They were from different worlds, different realities, but in the heat of battle they had become something more. A bond that had been tested by fire, and still it held strong. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. Rishka turned toward him, her eyes locking with his. For a moment, she said nothing, as if trying to find the right words, or perhaps unsure of what to say at all. Finally, she nodded, though the sadness in her expression remained. "I will be." Garen stepped forward, his steps measured but filled with a quiet strength. "We still have a long road ahead of us," he said, his gaze flickering to the wreckage of the village and then to the forest beyond. "There's more to this than just one man." She met his eyes, and for the first time since their encounter with the hooded man, she saw not just the warrior standing before her, but the man who had chosen to stand beside her. A man who had risked everything, not for the glory of battle, but because of something deeper, something neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "The darkness isn't gone. It's only just begun." Later that evening, they sat around a small fire, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. Archon lay nearby, his massive form curled on the ground, his eyes watching the surroundings warily. The night had settled in, and the forest felt alive with the quiet hum of nature reclaiming its place. Rishka leaned back against a large stone, her arms wrapped around her knees as she stared into the flames. The loss of her home, her family, and everything she had known still hung heavily in the air. There was a numbness to her now, a kind of quiet resignation. She had faced unimaginable loss, and yet she continued to move forward. For what, though? She wasn't sure anymore. Garen watched her, his thoughts a tangled mess of questions and unspoken truths. He knew there was more to her than the fierce warrior who had fought beside him. Beneath the surface, there was something fragile, something delicate that she kept hidden behind walls of strength. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, filled with a sincerity that made Rishka look up at him. "For everything you've lost." Rishka didn't immediately respond. her golden eyes distant, almost lost in the flames. It took her a moment before she spoke, her voice softer than he expected. "You can't apologize for this," she said, shaking her head. "None of this is your fault." Garen hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "But I'm here. I've seen what you've gone through, and I'm still here." His gaze softened as he met her eyes. "I want to help." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible sigh, she shifted her position, moving closer to the fire. "You've already helped," she said, her voice low but filled with gratitude. "In ways you don't even know." Garen felt a flicker of warmth in his chest at her words, but it was fleeting. There was something between them now, something unspoken, but undeniable. Their bond had deepened, and while the weight of her past still clung to her, there was an openness in her that hadn't been there before. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the night surrounding them. Archon shifted restlessly, but there was no immediate danger. The night was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire. Rishka finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not sure what comes next. After all this." Garen turned toward her, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to know right now," he said gently. "We take it one step at a time." She met his gaze, her eyes searching, as though trying to see if he truly understood. Then, as if a decision had been made, she leaned forward, her movements slow, almost tentative. "I can't do this alone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Garen didn't respond right away. Instead, he shifted closer, closing the distance between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their silence filled with an understanding neither had expected. Garen reached out, his hand hovering just above hers for a heartbeat before he gently took her hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a ripple of something through her, a quiet, soothing sensation that settled deep in her chest. She looked at him, her golden eyes meeting his, filled with a mixture of uncertainty and something deeper, something more vulnerable. And in that moment, neither of them needed to say anything more. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the night, as they sat side by side, silently acknowledging the connection that had formed between them. It was a connection forged in battle, in loss, and in the shared understanding of what it meant to survive. But beneath it all, there was something more, a subtle, undeniable bond that neither of them had yet fully explored. And as the night stretched on, both of them knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The path ahead was still uncertain, but the strength of their shared resolve was undeniable. Tomorrow they would take the next step in their journey. But tonight, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet peace, wrapped in the comfort of their unspoken connection. And though the challenges that lay ahead were many, they were no longer alone. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, and the sounds of birdsong echoed faintly in the distance. Garen stood at the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The fire had burned low overnight, but the embers still glowed faintly as Rishka and Archon packed their belongings. The silence between them was comfortable, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged over the course of their journey. Even with the growing weight of the world around them, there was something undeniably peaceful in this shared moment. Rishka stood a few feet away, her back straight and her posture tense, as if she were preparing for whatever was to come next. Garen watched her for a long moment, knowing that her mind was likely racing with the same thoughts that circled in his own. They had fought together, survived together, but the road ahead promised only more challenges, more dangers, more heartbreak. She turned to face him, catching him in the act of watching her. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, a wordless understanding passed between them. No more pretending, no more walls. "What's next?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Garen exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The question had been coming for days, but neither of them had dared to voice it until now. He had known the moment would come, the moment when they would have to face the truth about what they were truly up against. It wasn't just the forces they had fought before. It was something deeper, more insidious, something that reached into their very souls. I don't know, Garen admitted, his voice low, but we face it together, Rishka, whatever it is. She met his gaze, her golden eyes steady, and nodded slowly. The weight of her own emotions was evident in the tightness of her features, but she didn't look away. For the first time, Garen could see the fear in her eyes, and it stirred something inside him. It wasn't just fear for her own safety. It was a fear for what they had become, what they might become if they weren't careful. I think I'm afraid, she said softly, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the morning. Not of the battles ahead, but of losing what we've built. Garen stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath his feet. He didn't know what to say. He didn't have the words to ease her mind. Instead, he simply reached out and placed his hand gently on her arm, his touch light but filled with reassurance. He could feel the tension in her body, the strain of holding everything together. You won't lose me, he said, his voice steady. Not now, not ever. Her gaze softened, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Garen's heart skip a beat. In that brief moment, it was as if the weight of everything else in the world had faded away. It was just the two of them standing together, and that was all that mattered. Rishka reached out and took his hand in hers, her grip firm and certain. There was a quiet strength in her touch that reassured him more than any words could. They didn't need to say anything more. Not yet. The time would come when they had to confront the darkness waiting for them. But for now, they would simply exist together in this fragile, fleeting moment of peace. As they packed the final few things, Garen couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something deep within him. The connection he felt with Rishka was undeniable, something beyond the physical or the superficial. It was something that tied them together in ways he hadn't fully realized until now. The realization startled him, but it was also strangely comforting. Let's go, Rishka said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. She had already gathered the rest of her gear, and her eyes were once again filled with the determination that had first drawn him to her. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Garen nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and concern. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, a pull that had only grown stronger since their journey began. And yet, with that pull came the nagging fear that something was bound to tear them apart. The future was uncertain, and the path they walked was anything but safe. But he would follow her wherever it took them. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Archon's low growl interrupted their thoughts. The massive beast had caught the scent of something, a presence lingering just beyond their sight. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and Garen's grip on his sword tightened instinctively. Rishka halted, her senses sharpened. She had always been attuned to the world around her, but there was something unsettling about the way Archon reacted now. This wasn't just a passing threat. It was something more, something that was watching them, waiting. We need to keep moving, Rishka said, her voice low but urgent. Garen felt the shift in the air as well, the tension that had been growing for days finally coming to a head. Something was wrong. The quiet of the forest, the peace they had found for the moment, was about to be shattered. Without a word, they quickened their pace, the sound of their footfalls muffled by the thick underbrush. Garen's mind raced, his hand never leaving the hilt of his sword as his eyes scanned the shadows around them. The air felt charged, as though something was about to break through. Then, as if summoned by their haste, the presence revealed itself. A figure stepped from the trees, tall and cloaked in darkness. Its silhouette was unmistakable, a creature of shadow and malice. The very air around it seemed to warp, the forest holding its breath. Rishka's hand tightened on her blade, and Garen instinctively stepped closer to her. Archon growled, his hackles raised as the creature's eyes glowed an eerie red, locking onto them with an intensity that made Garen's skin crawl. Who are you? Garen demanded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The creature tilted its head, its eyes flickering between them. A low chuckle escaped its lips, sending a chill down Garen's spine. You've made quite the impression, the creature said, its voice smooth, almost melodic. But I'm afraid this is only the beginning. Garen's heart skipped a beat as the creature took a step forward, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. The forest seemed to grow darker, the light fading as the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. This wasn't just a foe they were facing. It was something much darker, something that could tear their bond apart. And whatever came next, Garen knew they would have to face it together. But would they survive? Or would the darkness swallow them whole?